At one of Britain's busiest airports, thousands of passengers move through the terminal each day, following routines so familiar they rarely draw a second glance. Among them were a series of ordinary journeys that appeared no different from countless others. Short trips, quiet returns, and families traveling without incident. Yet as weeks passed and records slowly accumulated, investigators began to notice that certain movements aligned too precisely to ignore. What initially looked like coincidence would gradually reveal a complex story of oversight, patience, and accountability, unfolding almost entirely out of public view. Police examined these journeys more than once, yet at the time, nothing about them appeared unusual. Early morning departures, short European returns, familiar terminals, and passengers moving calmly through Birmingham Airport blended into the daily rhythm of one of the UK's busiest travel hubs. For staff and travelers alike, it was a place defined by routine. Suitcases rolling across polished floors, quiet announcements echoing through departure halls, and families reuniting after flights. On the surface, everything followed a pattern that repeated itself thousands of times each week. Birmingham Airport sits at the heart of the Midlands, serving communities spread across cities, suburbs, and towns where international travel is often woven into ordinary family life. Trips to visit relatives abroad, brief European breaks, and seasonal journeys are common and rarely draw attention. In late 2024, this sense of normality remained firmly in place. Flights arrived and departed on schedule, and border processes continued as designed, guided by risk assessments refined over decades. Nothing immediately suggested that a complex criminal investigation was slowly forming beneath this calm exterior. Among the travelers passing through were individuals who, by every outward measure, appeared entirely unremarkable. They traveled in small groups or pairs, carried standard luggage, and followed the same routes as countless others before them. Records would later show that these journeys were frequent but short, often lasting only a few days. At the time, this detail was simply another data point in an enormous system designed to process millions of movements a year. It raised no immediate concerns and prompted no direct intervention. Away from the airport, everyday life continued much the same. In parts of northern England, families went about their routines, balancing work, education, and domestic responsibilities. In neighborhoods like Bradford and Oldham, communities shaped by generations of migration maintained close family ties, with extended relatives often living nearby or staying in regular contact. Travel abroad, especially to Europe or South Asia, was not unusual and rarely questioned. Against this backdrop, nothing distinguished these households from thousands of others across the country. Authorities later explained that major investigations rarely begin with dramatic moments. Instead, they often start quietly, with small observations noted and stored for later comparison. In this case, it was not a single incident, but a series of patterns that would eventually draw attention. Travel data, border records, and routine checks are constantly reviewed by analysts whose role is to look for inconsistencies rather than obvious wrongdoing. At first, these patterns seemed incomplete, offering no clear narrative or explanation. The National Crime Agency and partner organizations operate within strict legal frameworks, requiring evidence to meet high thresholds before any action is taken. As a result, early-stage assessments tend to be cautious and deliberately restrained. Information is reviewed, cross-referenced, and often left unresolved until further context emerges. In late summer and early autumn of 2024, several entries began to sit uncomfortably alongside one another, though no formal conclusions were drawn. What stood out was not behavior at the airport itself, but repetition. Journeys followed similar timelines, destinations overlapped, and returns coincided with specific flight schedules. None of these details were, on their own, remarkable. Taken together, however, they suggested a level of coordination that merited quiet observation. Even then, officials were careful not to overinterpret what could easily have been coincidence. During this period, there was no disruption to the travelers involved. They passed through security, collected luggage, and exited the terminal without difficulty. CCTV footage later reviewed would show nothing overtly suspicious, no hurried movements, no visible signs of stress, and no attempts to avoid staff. Their composure was consistent with that of ordinary passengers accustomed to frequent travel. Within investigative teams, discussion remained measured. Analysts noted the patterns and flagged them for continued monitoring, emphasizing that the information was incomplete. No accusations were made and no assumptions recorded. The focus remained on understanding whether these journeys aligned with legitimate explanations or whether further scrutiny was justified. This stage of an investigation is often invisible to the public, unfolding entirely within offices and databases rather than on the ground. At the same time, unrelated cases were moving through the criminal justice system, each following its own trajectory. Birmingham Airport, like other major transport hubs, had previously featured in a range of enforcement actions over the years. These cases varied widely in scale and circumstance, reinforcing the importance of not conflating separate incidents without evidence. Investigators are trained to treat each emerging situation independently, even when locations or timeframes overlap. As autumn progressed, analysts continued to build a picture using open-source information, travel records, and legally obtained data. The emphasis remained on context rather than conclusions. Officials later stated that patience at this stage is essential, as premature action can compromise both civil liberties and the integrity of any future proceedings. For weeks, the information remained just short of what was required to escalate matters. The turning point did not come from a dramatic discovery, but from comparison. When new data was placed alongside earlier records, subtle inconsistencies became harder to dismiss. Timelines aligned too precisely, and associations between individuals appeared more structured than previously understood. Still, these observations were framed as questions rather than findings, guiding analysts toward closer examination rather than immediate enforcement. By early November 2024, authorities had reached a point where continued passive monitoring was no longer sufficient. While nothing illegal had been directly observed, the accumulation of information suggested that further attention was warranted. Decisions at this level are never taken lightly and involve consultation across departments to ensure proportionality and legal compliance. It was at this moment, as routine operations continued and travelers moved freely through the terminal, that officials quietly prepared for the next stage. No alarms were raised and no public signals were given. To the untrained eye, Birmingham Airport remained exactly as it had always been. Yet within official channels, a shift had occurred, prompted by one small but increasingly difficult to ignore inconsistency that required closer examination. That inconsistency centered on how often certain journeys intersected with one another. When analysts placed the travel records side by side, they noticed that separate bookings, made by different people, repeatedly aligned around the same narrow windows of time. Individually, each trip appeared routine. Collectively, they suggested coordination that went beyond coincidence. This observation did not imply wrongdoing, but it did justify a deeper review under existing risk assessment procedures. Authorities began to widen the lens, examining not just flights but surrounding activity. Arrival times, departure gaps, and booking methods were assessed alongside publicly available information. The aim was not to confirm suspicion, but to rule out innocent explanations. Investigators are required to actively seek reasons why a pattern might be legitimate before considering alternative conclusions. In this case, however, the explanations became harder to reconcile with the consistency observed. What drew particular attention was the structure of the travel itself. Journeys were short, sometimes lasting only a day or two, and destinations were limited to a small group of European cities. Returns often coincided with the arrival of long-haul flights from outside Europe. This overlap, while not inherently problematic, occurred with enough regularity to raise questions within analytical teams tasked with identifying risk trends rather than individual offenses. At this stage, individuals were still not treated as suspects. Their names were recorded only as data points within a broader assessment. Officials avoided language that implied intent, focusing instead on documenting timelines and associations. This careful approach reflects the legal standards governing intelligence work in the UK, where proportionality and necessity must be demonstrated at every step. As analysts continued their review, connections between some of the travelers became clearer. Shared addresses, family relationships, and overlapping contact details suggested that these journeys were not isolated. Family travel is common and lawful, but when combined with the timing patterns already noted, it added another layer of complexity. Investigators began to map these relationships, not to assign blame, but to understand the structure of the activity they were observing. During this period, routine border processes continued uninterrupted. There were no searches, detentions, or visible interventions. Border Force officers remained unaware of any developing assessment, as early-stage analysis is typically handled away from frontline operations. This separation helps ensure that passengers are treated fairly and without prejudice unless clear grounds for action exist. Behind the scenes, information sharing protocols were followed carefully. Data was cross-checked with existing records to ensure accuracy and to identify any previous interactions with law enforcement. Most of the individuals involved had no recent criminal history that would explain heightened attention. This absence of obvious risk factors made the emerging patterns more difficult to interpret, reinforcing the need for caution. Investigators also considered alternative explanations. Could the travel be linked to legitimate business, family obligations, or shared leisure plans? Analysts reviewed available information for indicators of employment, education, or other lawful reasons for frequent movement. In several instances, these explanations appeared plausible in isolation, but did not fully account for the coordination observed across multiple individuals. As autumn moved toward winter, the assessment reached a new phase. Rather than simply recording patterns, officials began to monitor upcoming travel more closely. This did not involve direct engagement with passengers, but it did mean allocating additional analytical resources to specific dates and flights. The focus remained on observation rather than intervention, consistent with best practice guidelines. During this time, parallel cases at Birmingham Airport continued to demonstrate how varied smuggling and trafficking investigations can be. Some involved impulsive decisions quickly uncovered, while others revealed long-running activity built on familiarity with systems and routines. These historical examples informed the cautious approach being taken, reminding investigators that appearances can be misleading in either direction. The individuals whose journeys were under review continued their routines without interruption. CCTV footage later examined showed calm, ordinary behavior, waiting near baggage carousels, checking phones, and moving through public areas without haste. There was nothing to suggest awareness of any scrutiny, nor any effort to conceal identity or movement. This composure was consistent across multiple visits. Within investigative teams, discussions remained factual and restrained. Notes focused on what was known rather than what was assumed. Senior officers emphasized the importance of letting evidence guide decisions, warning against confirmation bias. The objective was not to build a narrative, but to establish whether sufficient grounds existed to justify escalation under the law. The moment that shifted internal thinking came when analysts compared these journeys with wider intelligence streams. Without relying on operational detail, authorities later stated that contextual information from separate sources began to align with the travel data. This alignment did not confirm criminal activity, but it reduced the likelihood that the observed patterns were coincidental. At this point, a decision was made to move from passive assessment to active monitoring within legal boundaries. This transition is significant as it requires formal authorization and clear justification. The threshold is deliberately high to protect individual rights and ensure accountability. Once met, it allows agencies to coordinate more closely and prepare for potential action if warranted. Despite this internal shift, nothing changed on the surface. Flights continued to arrive, passengers continued to disembark, and the airport environment remained unchanged. The individuals involved booked further travel, unaware that their movements were now being observed with greater attention. For investigators, the priority was to ensure that any future steps would be proportionate, evidence-based, and defensible in court. As the next scheduled journeys approached, officials understood that they were nearing a decisive moment. The information gathered so far had not led to accusations or arrests, but it had reached a point where inaction could no longer be justified. Careful preparation began, focused not on assumption, but on readiness. Authorities now recognized that closer attention was required to understand what these patterns truly represented and where they might lead. That recognition prompted a broader review of activity beyond a single terminal or set of dates. Once closer attention had been authorized, analysts began to consider how the emerging picture fitted into wider national and international contexts. This stage was less about individuals and more about systems, how information flows between agencies, how trends are identified, and how separate data points can sometimes reveal a larger structure when viewed together. Records showed that the journeys under observation did not exist in isolation. Similar patterns had appeared at other points of entry across the UK, though not necessarily involving the same people. This did not suggest a direct connection, but it did indicate that the methods being assessed were not unique. For investigators, this reinforced the need to approach the situation as a potential network issue rather than a single incident. Coordination between agencies increased, with information shared under established legal frameworks. This process is deliberate and often slow, designed to ensure accuracy and accountability. Each contribution was assessed on its own merits before being incorporated into a growing overview. At no point were assumptions made about intent. The focus remained on understanding structure, timing, and association. Within this wider assessment, attention turned to travel routes rather than destinations alone. Analysts examined how short-haul European flights intersected with long-haul arrivals and how these overlaps appeared repeatedly over time. The emphasis was not on how travel occurred, but on when and how often certain alignments took place. These questions are central to identifying organized activity without relying on intrusive or speculative measures. At the same time, investigators reviewed financial and administrative information available through lawful channels. This included publicly accessible records and material already held by authorities. The aim was to determine whether there were indicators of undeclared activity or unexplained resources. In many cases, nothing stood out immediately, which again required analysts to balance curiosity with restraint. Family relationships, already noted in earlier reviews, became more relevant as the scope widened. Authorities considered how family-run enterprises, both legitimate and illegitimate, can operate with a high degree of trust and internal discipline. This understanding did not imply guilt, but it informed how analysts interpreted coordination and communication patterns observed within the data. As this broader picture developed, officials remained aware of the need to avoid tunnel vision. Internal guidance emphasized that organized crime can take many forms and that not every repeated pattern leads to criminal findings. To counter this, teams were encouraged to test alternative explanations at each stage and to document why those explanations were accepted or rejected. During this period, historical case studies were consulted to provide context. Previous investigations had shown that complex operations often rely on predictability and routine rather than concealment. These insights were used to frame questions, not to draw parallels. Each situation is unique, and investigators are trained to resist the temptation to fit new information into old narratives. As autumn turned to early winter, the volume of material under review increased. Analysts worked to consolidate information into a coherent timeline that could be understood by oversight bodies and, if necessary, by a court. This required translating raw data into clear, factual summaries without interpretation. Accuracy at this stage is essential, as errors can undermine months of work. One significant development came when authorities identified points at which several strands of information converged. Travel records, associations, and external intelligence began to align around specific periods. This convergence suggested that upcoming dates might be particularly informative if observed carefully. Still, officials were careful to frame this as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. Preparation for this next phase involved logistical planning rather than enforcement. Agencies discussed staffing, legal authority, and procedural safeguards to ensure that any observation would be conducted lawfully and respectfully. The emphasis was on readiness rather than action, reflecting the principle that intervention should occur only when clearly justified. Throughout this time, the individuals whose movements were being observed remained unaware of the growing scope of the assessment. Their travel continued as before, with no apparent changes in behavior. To airport staff and other passengers, they remained indistinguishable from anyone else moving through the terminal. The widening of the investigation also prompted reflection within agencies about resource allocation and proportionality. Senior officials reviewed the case to ensure that attention remained justified and that it did not divert focus from higher-risk threats. This internal scrutiny is a critical safeguard, ensuring that investigations remain grounded in evidence rather than momentum. By the end of this phase, authorities found themselves at a pivotal point. The situation had evolved from a narrow review of travel patterns into a multi-layered assessment involving several agencies and jurisdictions. While no public action had yet been taken, the direction of the work had changed. What began as a series of quiet observations was now recognized as part of a broader, more complex picture, one that required careful management as the investigation moved into its next stage. With that broader picture established, the focus shifted from analysis to sustained oversight. Agencies involved understood that the next phase would test both patience and process. The objective was not to accelerate toward outcomes, but to ensure that any future decisions rested on material that could withstand scrutiny. This required careful coordination, clear communication, and strict adherence to legal safeguards. Senior officers authorized additional monitoring measures within existing frameworks, ensuring that each step was documented and proportionate. Oversight mechanisms were engaged, and internal reviews confirmed that the threshold for continued attention had been met. These checks are a routine but essential part of UK investigations, designed to prevent overreach and to protect individual rights throughout prolonged inquiries. As attention intensified, investigators reviewed material in greater depth. Travel records were revisited alongside association data, and timelines were refined to remove ambiguity. This process often involves revising earlier assumptions and correcting minor errors, reinforcing the importance of accuracy over speed. Nothing was taken at face value, and each piece of information was assessed in relation to the whole. Coordination with airport authorities became more structured, though still discreet. Frontline staff were not directed to act differently toward passengers, but contingency planning began in case further steps became necessary. This planning focused on safety, clarity of roles, and minimizing disruption to the public. At no stage were individuals singled out or treated differently in public-facing processes. Investigators also prepared for the possibility that observations might ultimately lead nowhere. This outcome is common in intelligence-led work and is considered a success when it confirms that no wrongdoing has occurred. As such, teams remained cautious in their language and documentation, repeatedly emphasizing uncertainty rather than expectation. During this phase, a review of previous enforcement outcomes provided additional context. Authorities examined how long-term investigations had progressed in other cases and how evidence had been presented in court. These lessons informed how information was being organized and preserved, ensuring that, if required, it could be explained clearly and without reliance on speculation. As weeks passed, the monitored activity continued to follow familiar patterns. Journeys occurred as anticipated, associations remained consistent, and timelines aligned as previously observed. This continuity strengthened the case for continued attention, not because it confirmed illegality, but because it demonstrated reliability in the data being collected. The pressure at this stage was procedural rather than dramatic. Investigators were conscious that any misstep could compromise months of work or affect the rights of those involved. Decisions were reviewed collectively, with legal advisors consulted regularly. This deliberate pace can appear slow from the outside, but it reflects the standards required for complex cases. One unexpected development emerged from the review of ancillary information. Without revealing operational detail, authorities later indicated that a factual inconsistency surfaced that could not be easily explained by benign circumstances. This discrepancy did not point directly to a specific offense, but it challenged earlier assumptions and required further clarification. Rather than prompting immediate action, this revelation led to additional verification. Analysts sought to confirm whether the inconsistency resulted from error, coincidence, or a gap in understanding. This verification process involved cross-checking sources and, where necessary, seeking clarification through formal channels. Throughout this time, communication between agencies remained continuous. Updates were shared in scheduled briefings, ensuring that everyone involved had a consistent understanding of the case's status. Differences of interpretation were discussed openly, and alternative viewpoints were recorded. This transparency is a key feature of collaborative investigations, reducing the risk of unilateral decisions. The individuals at the center of the assessment continued their routines without interruption. There were no visible signs of awareness or concern, and no changes in travel behavior. For investigators, this stability removed one variable from consideration, allowing them to focus on the information rather than speculation about intent. As the investigation progressed, preparations were made for potential escalation. This did not mean enforcement was imminent, but it did require readiness. Plans were drafted outlining how various outcomes would be handled, from closure of the inquiry to further legal steps. Each scenario was considered in advance to ensure that responses would be measured and appropriate. By the end of this phase, the investigation had reached a critical juncture. The accumulated material had not yet been tested in open proceedings, but it had undergone extensive internal scrutiny. The unexpected inconsistency identified earlier remained unresolved, standing out against an otherwise stable picture. It was this unresolved detail, small but persistent, that shifted the balance and prompted officials to consider whether the time had come to move from observation to formal action. That consideration led to a carefully planned transition from monitoring to formal intervention. Officials understood that this stage carried the greatest responsibility, as it involved direct engagement and the potential for life-altering consequences. Every step was reviewed to ensure it met legal standards and reflected the principles of fairness and proportionality that govern the UK justice system. When the decision was taken to act, it was done quietly and methodically. Coordination between agencies ensured that roles were clearly defined and that any engagement would be controlled and respectful. The priority was to secure evidence lawfully and to prevent disruption to the wider public. Airport operations continued as normal, with no public indication that an investigation had reached a decisive point. Authorities later confirmed that the intervention unfolded as planned. Individuals linked to the earlier assessment were approached at a moment when all procedural safeguards were in place. There were no public scenes and no immediate statements. Instead, actions were taken calmly, reflecting the measured approach that had characterized the investigation from the outset. Following these initial steps, the focus shifted to verification and accountability. Items and records relevant to the inquiry were secured under warrant, and individuals were informed of their rights. Throughout this process, officials avoided commentary or speculation, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. The emphasis remained on process rather than outcome. As the case moved into the formal justice system, court proceedings were scheduled in accordance with standard practice. Hearings took place at Birmingham Crown Court, where matters were presented in a structured and factual manner. Prosecutors outlined the findings of the investigation, while defense representatives were given full opportunity to respond. The court's role was not to interpret patterns or suspicions, but to assess evidence against the law. Judicial oversight ensured that only verified material was considered. Where evidence was challenged, it was examined carefully, and where gaps existed, they were acknowledged. This transparency is fundamental to maintaining public confidence in complex cases, particularly those involving multiple defendants and extended timelines. During sentencing hearings, the court addressed the seriousness of organized criminal activity and its wider impact. Remarks focused on harm to communities, the strain placed on public institutions, and the importance of deterrence. At the same time, individual circumstances were considered, reflecting the court's obligation to balance accountability with fairness. Financial consequences formed part of the outcome, in line with legislation designed to prevent individuals from benefiting from unlawful activity. Orders were made to recover assets where appropriate, reinforcing the principle that crime should not result in financial gain. These measures were presented as preventative rather than punitive, aimed at disrupting future wrongdoing. Throughout this phase, authorities reiterated that the investigation had been evidence-led and proportionate. Public statements avoided dramatic language, instead emphasizing the role of cooperation between agencies and the effectiveness of existing safeguards. The message was clear. Outcomes were the result of sustained, lawful work rather than isolated actions. For those directly affected, the resolution marked a profound change. Court decisions brought clarity where uncertainty had existed for months, replacing quiet observation with formal conclusions. While the proceedings represented an ending to one process, they also served as a reminder of the long path from initial assessment to judicial outcome. As the final hearings concluded, officials reflected internally on the case. Reviews considered what had worked well and where processes could be improved, feeding into future policy and training. This reflective practice is standard following complex investigations and is intended to strengthen institutional learning rather than assign blame. The resolution phase closed with a sense of completion, but not finality. The legal outcomes addressed specific actions and responsibilities, yet the broader questions raised by the case remained relevant. It was these wider implications, extending beyond the courtroom and into the community, that would shape the discussion moving forward. Those wider implications became clearer in the months that followed, as the immediate focus on court outcomes gave way to reflection within the communities connected to the case. For many residents, the events prompted quiet discussion rather than public debate. The locations involved returned to their routines, yet the knowledge that a complex investigation had unfolded largely unseen left a lasting impression on how ordinary environments can intersect with serious criminal inquiries. Community leaders and local organizations emphasize the importance of separating individual responsibility from collective identity. They noted that the actions examined by the court did not define the wider communities from which those individuals came. This distinction was important in preventing misunderstanding and in maintaining trust between residents and public institutions. Authorities echoed this message, stressing that investigations are behavior-focused, not community-focused. Within law enforcement and regulatory bodies, the case contributed to ongoing discussions about prevention and early intervention. Reviews highlighted how data-led approaches, when applied carefully, can identify risks without relying on stereotypes or assumptions. The emphasis remained on proportionality, ensuring that attention is guided by evidence rather than perception. These lessons were incorporated into training and internal guidance, reinforcing existing standards. The airport environment also benefited from the review process. While no immediate procedural changes were announced publicly, officials acknowledged that each major case informs future practice. Improvements often occur incrementally, refining coordination, communication, and oversight rather than introducing visible new measures. For travelers, this meant that the balance between security and convenience remained largely unchanged. For families affected by the proceedings, the aftermath was more personal and complex. Court outcomes brought legal resolution, but they did not answer every question or erase the impact of prolonged uncertainty. Support services became relevant at this stage, offering assistance with adjustment and reintegration where appropriate. These services operate quietly, recognizing that long-term outcomes depend on stability as much as enforcement. The case also contributed to broader policy conversations about organized crime and its social dimensions. Experts noted that such activity often relies on trust, familiarity, and routine, rather than overt force. Understanding this dynamic is essential for prevention strategies that focus on disruption and education rather than reaction alone. By addressing underlying vulnerabilities, authorities aim to reduce the likelihood of similar cases emerging. Media coverage, where it occurred, was measured compared to more sensational stories. Official statements encouraged responsible reporting, focusing on verified facts and legal outcomes. This approach helped to maintain public understanding without amplifying fear or misinformation. It also reflected a wider recognition that complex cases require careful explanation rather than simplified narratives. In academic and professional circles, the investigation was referenced as an example of patient, intelligence-led work. Analysts highlighted how the absence of early intervention was not a failure, but a deliberate choice rooted in legal and ethical considerations. This perspective reinforced the idea that effectiveness in such cases is often defined by what is avoided as much as by what is done. Over time, the case receded from public attention, replaced by new events and concerns. Yet its influence persisted in less visible ways. Policies were reviewed, practices refined, and institutional knowledge expanded. These outcomes are rarely headline-grabbing, but they form the foundation of long-term improvements in public safety and governance. For the wider public, the story served as a reminder that complex investigations do not always unfold dramatically. They often develop quietly through observation, verification, and restraint. The absence of visible action does not indicate inaction, but rather a commitment to due process and accountability. As daily life continued at Birmingham Airport and beyond, the routines described at the beginning of this account remained unchanged. Passengers still arrived and departed, families still traveled, and the systems designed to protect the public continued their work largely out of sight. What had changed was an understanding, shared by those involved, of how ordinary patterns can sometimes carry deeper significance when viewed over time. In reflecting on the entire sequence of events, one theme remained consistent: the importance of patience. From initial observation to final outcome, the process relied on waiting for clarity rather than forcing conclusions. This patience safeguarded rights, strengthened evidence, and ultimately ensured that decisions rested on fact rather than assumption. The investigation began with journeys that appeared routine and ended with outcomes determined by the rule of law. Between those points lay months of careful assessment, collaboration, and restraint. It is within that quiet space, where nothing appears to be happening, that much of the most important work takes place. If you're still here watching, thank you. Before you go, please subscribe to our channel, Dark Frame Stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another real-life mystery like this.